Welcome, everyone. We'll let everybody have a chance to connect, and we'll get going very shortly. Looks like everybody is here that was in the waiting room. Welcome. My name's Alan Goodwin. I'm the Deputy Project Manager for the UDO, and thank you for coming to this virtual information session. Before we get started, let me introduce the other staff we have with us today, in no particular order other than how they're appearing on my screen. Kevin May from the UDO team, Sandy Montgomery from our UDO team, Mariah Wozniak, also with the UDO team, and Laura Harmon, who is the project manager for the UDO. And I see we have a couple of planning commissioners here with us today, Shannon Neely and Douglas Welton, as well as some of our UDO advisory committee members, Patricia Campbell, Mark Laughlin, and Eric Zaverl. And also welcome to you, Ed. So let's get started. Let me share my screen. We just have a very few slides to go through to talk about this proposed text amendment. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. I don't anticipate that this should take very long to get through. So let's get started. Somebody just give me an okay that you can all see the slides.
Yep, you're good to go.
Thank you. So this is a virtual information session for a text amendment that has been filed. It's number 2023-106, and it deals with multifamily residential uses in CR and CG, that is regional commercial and general commercial zoning districts, when they are in a center's place type. So we'll be pretty informal. We'll go through the slides. Even though the slide says we'll stop after each segment, we won't. It's very brief. If you have questions, you can raise your hand in chat and we'll hopefully recognize you and you turn on your mic and you can ask, or if you want to put a question or a comment into the chat, we'll be monitoring that as well. And then when we get to the end of the slides, we'll just stop and take any questions that you may have. So it's important to know a little bit about place types because this text amendment deals with place types. So there are 10 place types that have been mapped through the comprehensive plan, the Charlotte Future 2040 comprehensive plan. And we're specifically talking about today the commercial place type, which is in red, which has 2 zoning districts that are appropriate for use in that. General commercial CG and regional commercial. And then we're going to be talking about the center's place types, which are the last 3 columns on this slide. The neighborhood activity center, which has 1 zoning district associated with it, the NC district. The community activity center place type, which has 2 zoning districts associated with it, CAC1 and CAC2, and finally the regional activity center, which has 3 zoning districts, as well as our TOD zoning districts, which can be used in any of those centers' place types if near transit. So to go over what these place types are, starting with the commercial place type, these are primarily auto-oriented commercial. Think, strip, parts of Independence Boulevard or parts of, I think this photo is maybe from Sugar Creek, near the I-85 interchange. They're primarily auto-oriented destinations for retail services and so forth, typically along major streets, arterials, and near interstates. They typically don't have a very robust pedestrian network of sidewalks and bike lanes and so forth. Versus our centers place types, and they're examples of each of those three centers place types. The neighborhood centers are the smallest of these place types, typically near or in residential neighborhoods that provide access to goods, services, dining, and residential use also. Our community activity centers are mid-sized, a little bit larger than neighborhoods. They draw from a wider base. They are typically along transit corridors or major roadways, and they also provide access to goods, services, dining, entertainment, and residential uses. And then finally, our regional activity centers are our largest activity centers. South Park is one example. Uptown is another example of a regional activity center. They draw from the region. And so just so we know what we're talking about when we get to the meat of this text amendment, which is, again, allowing multifamily uses in the CG, mainly general commercial zoning district, when those are in the center. We filed this text amendment on July 21st. Today, we're having this information session plus one more at 6 p.m. This evening. We will have a public hearing at the September 18th City Council meeting, and the City Council will take a vote on this text amendment at their October 16th meeting. So the slide shows an example of what we're talking about. And this particular example in the top image happens to be on 7th Street in Elizabeth. It was a former, it's a parcel that was formerly zoned B1 business in the old zoning ordinance. When the UDO went into effect on June 1st, it was translated to a new UDO district of CG, or general commercial, which doesn't allow multifamily residential. However, in centers, we want to allow multifamily residential. And so this is the problem that we're trying to address with this text amendment. You can see in the middle image, the parcel that we're talking about. It's a one-story strip commercial, and we're not suggesting that it needs to redevelop at all. It can operate just as it is and for as long as it does, but we all know that it's possible that at some point in the future, this could be redeveloped. You can see what's been built recently next door is a multifamily residential. So if this commercial strip were to redevelop in the future, we want to have that type of use as an option. And then finally, our bottom slide shows what has been developed immediately across the street from the site, which is a mixed use of commercial on the ground floor and multifamily residential on the upper floors. So this text amendment, if it were approved, would allow multifamily residential in these commercial zoning districts if they happen to be located in a center's place type. That is really the essential of this text amendment. So at this point, let me stop. And if you have questions, I'm not necessarily able to see the chat, so I'm going to rely on my colleagues to identify if you've got any comments or questions in chat.
We have neither of those, but I'll also say to those in attendance here that you should have the ability to unmute yourselves and also turn your cameras on if you wish. So you can either go forward with comments or questions in the chat, or if you'd like to come off on mute and be on camera and ask your question, you can have that as well.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Pat Campbell. I'm just wanting to confirm I understood what you're saying. Based on the middle picture, the picture on the right falls under the old category, and you're trying to make it possible to align with the picture on the left and the picture on the bottom by changing the zoning, correct?
No. We're not changing the zoning. When the development in the middle picture that's circled, the commercial development was zone B1. When the UDO districts went into effect on June 1st, the B1 zoning went away, but it translated to a new UDO district of general commercial or CG. That's still the zoning for that site. We're not changing the zoning with this text amendment. All we're doing is allowing for multifamily residential to be developed in those zoning districts that used to be B1 or B2, but now are CG. Normally in the UDO, you would not be able to do a multifamily residential development in the CG district. We don't necessarily want residential in those commercial place types. However, sometimes those old B1 and B2 sites happen to be in an activity center where we do want multifamily residential. So this text amendment doesn't change the zoning. It simply allows for that use in those former business parcels that are now CG.
Okay, so they're giving them options.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay,
We're making a use permitted that wouldn't otherwise be permitted.
thank you.
Sure. Yeah, if that wasn't clear and if there's a better way for us to explain that, I know this is a little, you're not used to this living in this world, this can be a little confusing. So if you've got any thoughts on how we can make this a little more understandable for people, we're always open to trying different ways of explaining.
I have another question. Considering the 10-minute neighborhoods, if they went with the option of turning it to the picture on the left, how would that affect the 10-minute neighborhoods with businesses?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well,
Are you asking if they develop that site with multifamily, the circled site?
And didn't, like on the bottom, they're giving you the option with businesses underneath. But if they just go with the option on the left that's multifamily and this is a business, how does that affect the 10-minute neighborhoods?
So there still are additional businesses in the area. These may not be replaced, but this happens to be on 7th Street in Elizabeth. There are other nearby businesses. And so I think that's just bringing more people closer to those businesses and building up that 10-minute neighborhood. And so, and we are pretty flexible in what happens in our centers. So we allow a pretty wide range of uses, and that, you know, we're adding that option, but it, unless all the businesses in the larger area go away, that would be a problem. But as long as there's a market or demand, we expect those to be there in the 10-minute neighborhood to remain in place.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Great question.
I'd like to recognize and invite Eric to speak.
Thank you, Kevin. It's Eric Zavarro. I just wanted to clarify that this is still sort of a temporary measure, assuming that the community area planning and updating to the policy map would, and then the resulting rezoning that would occur after that. I know that's still probably some time out, but that would fix some of these problems as well, right?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, and I probably should have said that. This is a short-term fix for this particular issue, but we are going to be starting some community area planning across the city, which may either change the place types for certain parcels, or we're also doing what we're calling an alignment rezoning, which is also kicking off, which will happen over the next 2 or 3 years, which would look at a site like this through the alignment rezoning process and recognize that it's a mismatch and either suggest changing the place type, which in this particular example probably would not be the answer, or changing the zoning to something more appropriate for this neighborhood activity center. So likely through that alignment rezoning process, this little parcel in Elizabeth that we're using as an example would be rezoned at some point in the future. something that aligns with the place type.
And then Alan, just one follow up with that. Are there areas in that are not currently center place types on the policy map that maybe should be, that could be missed in this, stopgap text amendment? And I'm specifically thinking of areas in future Silver Line. But I'm assuming, I guess those would also be caught at some point, because I know there's a lot of commercial still in that area that could be future TOD in the future. But assuming, I guess we're probably a decade plus out from that would be fine. But was there any other areas like that that maybe missed, would be covered in a future text amendment, or are you confident that this fixes the majority of that?
I'm not sure. I mean, if you're asking, have we properly mapped all of the center's place types?
I guess I'm just asking that, since this was identified as a short-term fix, does this take care of the majority of this particular situations where we would want residential, more mixed use, or are there some items still missing that may not be covered with this text amendment?
This text amendment will cover every parcel that translated to CG that happens to be in a place, in a center's place type that has been mapped. It doesn't ensure that all of the place types have been properly mapped. And so that's a process that will be addressed through community area planning. So it's possible that there may be one of these parcels that is in a location that probably should be a center, but it currently is not mapped as a center. I'm not saying that's not possible. So this text amendment is not going to go that deep and try to figure out those possible locations, but it will cover every parcel that's zone CG or CR that happens to be in a mapped center's place type.
Yeah, Alan, if I can add on, as part of the community area planning and even the alignment rezoning, staff is going back and kind of double checking the policy map. And then there obviously is community engagement and input on the policy map. And that's where that change would be made. If there are some areas that are possibly place typed as commercial that maybe folks think would be more appropriate as one of the center's place type, that would happen really through the community area planning process. If that helps answer your question.
Thanks, Laura. It does. I was just curious if you had percentages, that's all, or data when you're working on this to identify those, like this would take care of, a majority of the things that we think, 80% of what should be mixed use, including residential in those areas. And there's maybe a certain percentage of areas that should be center place types, but would be fixed later. That's all. I was just wondering if you had data that you could share.
And we really don't, because at this point, the community area planning team is still in the midst of kind of double checking that map. I don't think they anticipate a vast number of changes, but they do anticipate some adjustments. So there could be some areas, but we don't have, that we would have to get the data from the long range group. And they're not finished with the input process yet. They're really only halfway through this year's part, and we'll be doing some next year as well. So we won't have that information until they have identified the changes that they think are appropriate to the map.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments before we wrap it up? Not seeing or hearing any. I think that's all we have. Thank you again for your attendance today. And if you think of any questions or anything else you'd like to speak about regarding this text amendment or anything in the UDO, we will. Let me share our email address for UDO questions. It's cltudoquestions@charlottenc.gov. You can send any questions you may have on the UDO to that email address, or if you have questions specifically about this text amendment, you can email them to me. My email address is agoodwin@charlottenc.gov. Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank
too.
you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming.
Bye.
Hey, Alan, if you had a second,